Tonight, a look at religious freedom around the world, including President Donald Trump's executive order on religious freedom. Also, a major ruling. The Supreme Court issues a decision on a case involving the use of public funds for religious schools. And be not afraid. Pope Francis has a message for Christians in the face of hostility and persecution. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, July 6th, 2020. Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight for a special edition of EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight, a look at the fight for religious freedom. We start with President Donald Trump's signing of an executive order to promote international religious freedom. It happened in early June. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports.
The president is bringing faith to the forefront. That executive order he signed at the White House is aimed at helping advance religious freedom across the globe.
President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania visit St. John Paul II National Shrine in Washington, a quiet moment of reflection under the bigger-than-life statue of one of the most popular Roman Catholic popes of all time. A shrine spokesman saying the visit was initially planned as the signing of an international religious freedom executive order and had been scheduled some time ago. The signing instead took place at the White House. It calls for at least $50 million per year for programs that advance international religious freedom, expands economic tools to support our allies on the issue, and more religious freedom training for federal employees who work overseas. Meantime, last night in the Rose Garden, the president remembering George Floyd.
All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd.
At the same time, promising a show of force to quell the riots.
I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
Here in the nation's capital, they've clearly beefed up security. Here at 17th in Pennsylvania, take a look behind me. That tall chain link fence was just installed. And right over here, buildings up and down the street, all boarded up.
In the same neighborhood, workers building up a protection wall, law enforcement shutting down this intersection. And speaking in Philadelphia, former Vice President Joe Biden looking himself to move into the Oval Office, ripped into the president.
Donald Trump has turned this country into a battlefield riven by old resentments and fresh fears. He thinks division helps him. His narcissism has become more important than the nation's well-being that he leads.
Thank you so much, Owen. Well, the executive order advances the president's previous call for other countries to end religious persecution, integrating that call into U.S. foreign policy. Right after the signing, I spoke to a Trump administration official working on religious freedom. U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, joins me now from the White House to talk more about today's executive order. Ambassador, welcome back to the show, and thank you for your time.
Hey, happy to join you, Tracy, and excited about this executive order that the president signed. I think it can be really useful in this push for international religious freedom.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time today and talking about it. Today's action budgets at least $50 million per year for programs that advance international religious freedom. Can you talk a little bit more about those programs and exactly how they will support this very important cause?
You know, if the $50 million is an increase from what we currently we're using on this, but the real crux of the program that he's done is that he's now within the next 180 days, there has to be a plan developed about how to integrate international religious freedom into all the parts and the tentacles of State Department, USAID. And so what you're really seeing taking place now is religious freedom, international religious freedom, going into all the various aspects of foreign policy of statecraft. So that's a fabulous move. The increase in the funding will be helpful, I think, in programming, and the programming is in a lot of different areas. A lot of times it's targeted where we've got a particular religious freedom problem and a nation that's willing to address it. Often you have religious freedom issues and the country's not willing to address it, and there really the money is not of much use to you. You're really looking more at a sanctions type issue in that situation.
Well, Ambassador, back in 2019, President Trump made history as the first American president to convene a meeting of global leaders at the United Nations General Assembly in order to address international religious freedom. How does today's order help the U.S. to support countries that are doing the right thing and also address those who aren't?
Well, this builds on what the president did at the UN General Assembly, which really was groundbreaking. I mean, nobody else had ever done that. The UN Secretary General was there, made a good, strong, positive statement. And for years, the issue of religious freedom has kind of been a backwater type of issue, unfortunately. And because of that, then you've seen this level of persecution grow around the world. You've seen 80% of the world's population live in a religiously restricted atmosphere. So the president's really put his mark on this one and say this is a foundational human right. We're going to push on it. And today's executive order builds on that. This is the first time we've ever had an executive order on international religious freedom. And it's the first time we've really had a mandate and had it from the president to now bleed this issue into all the aspects of statecraft and to do it as a whole of government approach. So it's also going to be in our development aid programs too and other programs across the U.S. government that have a foreign reach to them. So this is a big issue, and it really builds on what the president did at the UN.
Yeah, and I also understand that today's action also mandates that more federal employees who work abroad undergo training on international religious freedom. Can you talk about that and the significance of that? And do you think this was important to include?
Well, I think it's very important to include. And the reason I think it's very important to include is that when we have people assigned overseas, they've got a whole array of topics that they're representing the United States government on. But what this says is now we want you to be particularly trained in these religious freedom issues because they're of importance to us on a basic building block of human rights. And so this training, I think, will then put more front of mind nature for our people that are representing us overseas to be able to see things, to be able to say, okay, this is an issue, we need to be addressing it more. This is, again, one of those things where, you know, as you know more, you learn more, you see more. And that's what I think this training will be beneficial for.
Well, Ambassador, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. I'm wondering if you can talk about how the lockdowns due to the pandemic, maybe how they have restricted religious freedom.
We've seen two things. They've been in opposite trends. One, we have seen the release of a number of religious prisoners around the world, and that's a good thing, and it needs to continue. In the bad category, what we've seen is a persecution of people of religious minorities in a number of countries where in cases they haven't been able to get the humanitarian aid or the health care that they need during the pandemic. And we've been pushing a lot of the countries around the world saying, you know, please treat them as equal citizens, not better, not worse than anybody else. So we have seen a lot of reaction, really, to the coronavirus that has had direct impact on the religious minority communities. We're stepping up more in our alliance efforts with other nations, 29 other nations on religious freedom, and that's worked during the pandemic. But we've got a long ways to go for religious freedom.
Absolutely. Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time and all that you do. We appreciate you taking time out to speak with us today. U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, thank you again.
Thank you, Tracy.
Coming up, Supreme Court decision. We have a report and analysis in a case impacting religious schools and tax credits. The Supreme Court has made it easier for religious schools to obtain public funds. The court's 5-4 ruling, with conservatives in the majority, came in a dispute over a Montana scholarship program for private K-12 education that also makes donors eligible for tax credits. On the last day of June, correspondent Mark Irons was outside of the Supreme Court with more.
A big win for religious freedom today. Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the court's 4 conservative justices in a decision that effectively strikes down a Montana amendment that barred public funds from going to private schools. Now, some of the justices say that this amendment was created with clear anti-Catholic bigotry.
Writing the court's majority opinion today, Chief Justice John Roberts said a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. In 2015, the Montana State Legislature created a tax credit program allowing contributions to be made to certain scholarships for private education. The scholarships could be used at both secular and religious schools, but almost all the recipients attend religious schools. After previous legal challenges, today the High Court upheld the program.
So it's a huge win for religious schools of all kinds.
Helen Alvarado, a law professor at George Mason University, says it looks as though this ruling will help strike down the Blaine Amendment. Present in more than 30 states' constitutions, it has kept public funds from private schools.
And no state law and no state constitution can trump the federal constitution.
Today, in conservative Justice Samuel Alito's opinion, he said the Blaine Amendment showed evidence of anti-Catholic bigotry. At previous oral arguments, Catholic Justice Brett Kavanaugh said grotesque religious bigotry against Catholics was underlying the amendment. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is applauding today's ruling.
So it is a tremendous win for us to see the Supreme Court, after so many years, come out and say that these Blaine amendments, which were born at a time of tremendous anti-Catholic bigotry, are in fact unconstitutional.
The Montana Federation of Public Employees says this ruling violates Montana's commitment to public education, our children, and Constitution. Now, Tracy, we could see some other big rulings from the High Court this week. Another case focused on Catholic schools and religious schools' ability to hire and fire employees, and that case that we've been following for years now involving the Little Sisters of the Poor. Tracy.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark. Correspondent Mark Irons reporting for us tonight. And the White House is also celebrating today's Supreme Court decision. A statement from White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany reads in part, quote, laws that condition public benefits like need-based academic scholarships on religious status demonstrate state-sanctioned hostility to religion, pressure people and institutions to censor their religious views, and stigmatize disfavored religions. Joining me now on Skype is Montse Alvarado, Vice President and Executive Director at Becket, a nonprofit law firm dedicated to protecting religious freedom. Montse, welcome back. Always so good to see you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's great to be here with you.
Well, Montse, I understand that Becket filed a friend of the court brief in support of the parents in this case. What does today's decision mean in terms of non-discrimination protections to religious schools?
Tracy, this has been part of the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty's work for over 25 years. Since our founding, we knew that this was what we wanted to focus on. And Blaine amendments today, on this historic day for religious freedom, are done. The court said that they were born of bigotry, and that history means that they violate the Free Exercise Clause. They violate religious freedom. They said that Blaine amendments can no longer be used to deny equal treatment to religious institutions just because they're religious, and that applies exactly to schools.
I know teachers' organizations have said that this ruling hurts public education. What do you say to that?
You know, the 10% of students that already go to private schools should have equal opportunities, just like public schools, to these public programs. Trinity Lutheran was a great case about a tire scraps program, recycling tire scraps for playgrounds, where the Supreme Court said that you were not allowed to discriminate against religious schools because they wanted to participate in this program because they were religious. You're not allowed to treat them differently because they're religious. So this is a fantastic decision for religious freedom. The limits that these anti-Catholic laws placed on the free exercise of religion are gone. They're gone, and we should celebrate that.
Yeah, and as you know, the Blaine amendments were a big focus in this case and today's opinion as well. For people who may not be familiar, can you fill us in on its history and impact on Catholics in this country?
Absolutely. At least 37 states have some form of Blaine amendment in their state constitution. With the founding, a lot of these states were forced to have these anti-Catholic sections within their constitutions as part of their welcome into our union. And we know that they came from the original anti-Catholic bigotry, where the main government at the time didn't want Catholics to have schools. And this limitation has that pernicious history that today has been ruled unconstitutional.
Yeah, and this decision recognizes the unconstitutionality of Montana's Blaine Amendment. What does that mean for other states?
You know, there are all sorts of ways that religious groups partner with the government, groups that do good. That includes groups like homeless shelters and prison ministries that fight recidivism and soup kitchens and hospitals. They all, in every state around the country now, have equal access to these government programs and to partnerships with the government on equal footing with non-religious institutions. So if the word sectarian appears in your state constitution, the government can no longer use that as an excuse for excluding religious groups in their partnerships and their contracts.
Montse, any final thoughts on today's ruling?
It's a fantastic ruling. I'm so pleased for what it means for our country, and especially in these times when we're watching protests around the country, these painful times on racism. It's nice to see the Supreme Court take a stand on religious discrimination as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Montse, thank you so much for coming on. We always appreciate it. Montse Alvarado, Vice President and Executive Director at Becket. Thank you again for your insights.
Thank you, Tracy.
Up next, we go around the world with allegations of religious persecution in China. A retired U.S. congressman is making it his mission to bring religious freedom to Nigeria. That country is number 3 on the Global Terrorism Index, just behind Afghanistan and Iraq. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports.
Tracy, former Congressman Frank Wolf is not resting quietly in retirement after leaving public office in January 2015. He is continuing his fight for religious liberty for the more than 200 million people living in the country of Nigeria.
By all definition, Boko Haram is committing genocide.
Former Virginia Congressman Frank Wolf says Nigeria faces 2 threats: Boko Haram, which has destroyed some 900 churches in Nigeria.
Boko Haram has killed more Christians in Nigeria than all the people that ISIS killed in Iraq and Syria combined. It's been a couple months ago, it was at 27,000. It has certainly increased since then. And by all definition, Boko Haram is committing genocide.
And Fulani militants who have slain Christian believers.
The Fulani militants in the last year or 2 have killed as many people as Boko Haram.
Wolf, along with other religious freedom advocates, held an online conference today advocating for help for the African country. Bishop Matthew Kuka of the Catholic Diocese of Sokoto, Nigeria, urged the media to get the message out and keep the faith.
I think that it is very clear to Christians all over the world that it will be dangerous, difficult for us to put our faith anywhere else other than in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
These religious leaders of Nigeria want world leaders to compel the Nigerian government to protect the poor, especially women and children.
And at the end of my life, which is I'm closer to the end than I am to the beginning, I believe I'll stand before God and have to give an explanation. And to whom much is given, much is required. Not expected, but required.
Wolf says he would like to see Secretary of State Mike Pompeo appoint a special envoy to put the pressure on the Nigerian government to do more for the Christian people. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
A recent report says in the first 4 months of this year, China has removed crosses from more than 250 churches. An Italian magazine covering human rights issues in the communist country says the removals are part of a government crackdown on religion. In June, Owen Jensen spoke to Gary Bauer, commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom.
Gary, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm great to be with you as always.
And, we were talking off camera, we don't realize how lucky we are in this country to worship freely, anywhere and any day of the week, any time, without worrying about the government coming in and saying, get out of there. But in China, a much different story. What do we know about the crackdown taking place there?
Well, look, there's absolutely no doubt about this. China has declared, communist China, I want to emphasize, has declared war on all religious faiths, and that's certainly the case with Christianity. As you pointed out, they're ordering the taking down of crosses from churches because obviously those crosses are the most obvious sign of the Christian faith. But it goes even beyond that. 18-year-olds, people in China, Christians in China, 18 and younger, are now banned from participating in church services. There's an effort underway to take down paintings and representations of Jesus and the Virgin Mary and replace them with pictures of President Xi. I couldn't help but think of the irony here. You know, long after President Xi has been deposited in the trash can of history, Jesus and the Virgin Mary will still be influencing the lives of countless people around the world.
Another report last week said state-sponsored Catholic churches in the communist country would not be allowed to reopen during the pandemic unless they preached on patriotism. What do you know about this?
Well, you know, patriotism, we tend to think of that as a very good thing, and it is a very good thing when you're living in a free country. But when you're living in a nation like communist China that is built on the idea that there is no God and that there is no loyalty that can be higher than loyalty to the state, well, when you're requiring Christians, Protestants, Catholics, if you're requiring any faith to embrace the idea that patriotism, Chinese style, trumps everything else, that's disgusting. That's clearly out of bounds. And you may have also heard about this. The government's also announced a plan to rewrite the Bible to make it more compatible with communism. Just historically, it's worth pointing this out. The last powerful regime that tried that was Nazi Germany, and it didn't work out very well for them.
Recently you saw the executive order on advancing international religious freedom signed by President Trump. Will that have any impact in a country like China?
Well, look, obviously they're a powerful country and they're going to resist all of these things. But I really want to take my hat off to the President, to Vice President Pence, to Secretary of State Pompeo, because they have made this issue of religious liberty, both here at home, but in what we're talking about internationally, they have made it a major issue in American foreign policy, even going so far as to suggest that if you want American foreign aid, we're going to start looking at every country in the world to see whether they allow their citizens this basic human right of being able to seek God and worship God as your heart and soul leads you to do.
We don't know how lucky we are here, Gary. Absolutely. It's just, you know, we're the greatest country in the world. We can worship when and where, however we want.
We should pray that we always have that liberty because there's always challenges to it.
Absolutely, as we've seen of recent. Gary Bauer, Commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And finally tonight, Pope Francis says Christians facing persecution, hostility, and anxiety should not have any fear.
Non dobbiamo avere paura. Il Padre si prende cura di noi.
At a Sunday talk to pilgrims at the Vatican in June, the Holy Father reminded the faithful our Lord has promised to take care of us in every situation and that we should continue to live our lives as Christians openly and publicly, even when faced by those using violence to spread their own message. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.